Sylvester Stallone never lost a fight on screen. But the battle that nearly broke him wasn't filmed in Philadelphia, wasn't set to a training montage, and nobody bought a ticket to watch it. There's a version of this man the world thinks it knows. The square jaw, the raspy drawl, the fists raised at the top of those stone steps. And then there's the version that existed before all of that. A child with a damaged face, shuffled between foster homes, laughed at in classrooms, quietly building something inside himself that the world hadn't asked for yet. What connects those two versions of the same person is a story worth telling properly. Not because it ends in triumph, but because it never really ends at all. Born on July 6, 1946, in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood of New York City, Stallone arrived in the world under difficult circumstances. His delivery was complicated, and doctors reportedly used forceps during the birth, a decision that left permanent consequences. The nerves controlling the left side of his face were damaged, resulting in partial paralysis that caused his lower lip to droop and shaped the slow, distinctive voice that millions would one day instantly recognize. As a trademark, it would eventually become iconic. As a childhood feature in a rough New York neighborhood, it was something far more painful to carry. Children absorb cruelty efficiently. They don't need to understand why something is different to single it out. The drooping lip, the heavy speech, these were enough. Classrooms became gauntlets. Playgrounds were exercises in social survival. He could feel the stifled laughter before it fully escaped anyone's mouth, and he learned to read the discomfort in adults' expressions long before he could put a name to what he was experiencing. That particular kind of loneliness, the kind that follows a child from room to room without ever announcing itself, settled into him early and stayed. Home offered little relief. His family environment was fractured and tense, and he spent portions of his youth moving between care facilities and foster homes. Stability was something other people seemed to have. The constant displacement left him with a feeling of rootlessness that went far deeper than geography. It was the sense that he didn't quite belong anywhere, to anyone, in any permanent way. Rather than collapsing under that weight, he did what imaginative children sometimes do when the real world becomes unbearable. He built a different one inside his head. He sought out dark, cheap movie theaters, watching men on screen who weren't perfect, men with rough edges and battered faces, who somehow still carried themselves with dignity. Those flickering images became a kind of education, not in any formal sense, but in the more essential sense of showing a wounded boy that a person could look like him, sound like him, be underestimated the way he was, and still matter. He started lifting weights in whatever makeshift space he could find. Cold basement floors, rusted equipment, the honest resistance of something that didn't judge him. Slowly, deliberately, he began building the exterior armor that might protect the sensitive interior he had never been able to hide well enough. By the time he was navigating his teenage years, he had already absorbed more emotional punishment than most people encounter in a lifetime. He carried it quietly, transforming it into fuel rather than letting it become bitterness. The forceps that had marked his face at birth hadn't defined his destination. They had simply rung the opening bell earlier than most, and he had been fighting ever since. Hollywood in the early 1970s was not a welcoming place for someone who looked and sounded like Stallone. The industry operated on categories, and he didn't fit neatly into any of the ones that led to leading roles. The drooping lip, the unusual gait, the voice that moved differently than expected. These were things casting directors quietly noted as liabilities. He took whatever work he could find, small parts, forgettable characters, roles that kept him just barely inside an industry that hadn't yet decided he belonged there. Meanwhile, he was watching his 20s dissolve into uncertainty, and the gap between where he was and where he needed to be felt less like a challenge and more like a verdict. He made a decision that was either deeply courageous or borderline reckless, depending on how it turned out. In a cold, barely furnished apartment, with almost nothing in his bank account, he sat down at a typewriter and wrote the story that had been living inside him. A small-time boxer from a poor neighborhood. A man everyone had written off. A man who just wanted one real chance to show that he hadn't been wrong to believe in himself. The character of Rocky Balboa was not invented so much as excavated, pulled out of the years of rejection and displacement and quiet endurance that had shaped the man doing the writing. When the screenplay attracted serious interest from producers and studio executives, the response was immediate and complicated. They loved the story. They wanted to make the film. But they did not want the unknown man with the crooked smile and the unconventional voice stepping in front of their cameras to play the lead. According to various accounts, they made increasingly substantial offers to purchase the script outright and have an established star take the role instead. Reports suggest the offers climbed to a figure in the region of $360,000, a sum that, for a man who was struggling to cover basic living expenses, would have been genuinely life-altering. He turned it down, every time. He held his position without apparent hesitation. The screenplay would not be sold unless he was the one playing Rocky Balboa. There was no backup plan, no safety net, just the absolute conviction that selling the script and walking away would be a betrayal he could never recover from, not financially, but personally. He was willing to stay broke rather than hand someone else the story that was, in every meaningful sense, his own. The studio eventually relented. They gave him a modest budget, a compressed production schedule, and the role he had refused to surrender. What followed was filmmaking that felt less like performance and more like confession. The freezing Philadelphia streets, the lonely apartment, the worn-out gym, the quiet ache of a man who had been overlooked for too long. None of it required much imagination from the actor inhabiting it. He had lived the emotional truth of all of it. Every labored step, every moment of self-doubt, every small gesture of stubborn hope came from somewhere real. The audience felt that. The film became a cultural phenomenon, and the man who had been turned away from so many doors suddenly found the world unable to stop talking about him. When the success of Rocky reshaped his career and the 1980s arrived with all of their excess and appetite for spectacle, Stallone became something larger than an actor. He became a symbol of toughness, of endurance, of the idea that the person everyone counted out could still be the last one standing. Rocky sequels followed. The Rambo franchise followed. His face was on posters across the world, and his name carried a kind of cultural weight that very few entertainers ever achieve. But maintaining that position required something of him that the posters never showed. The physical preparation for those roles was extreme by any reasonable standard. During his preparation for Rocky III, Stallone reportedly brought his body fat down to approximately 2.8%, a figure that sits at the outer boundary of what is physiologically sustainable and leaves almost no room for ordinary human comfort. Audiences watching those films saw the result, a physique that looked sculpted rather than lived in. What they didn't see was the man surviving on minimal food, grinding through punishing workouts daily, running on discipline and very little else. The image of invincibility was real, but the cost of maintaining it was something the image could never contain. The injuries that accumulated during those years were serious and lasting. During the filming of Rocky IV, Stallone has spoken about asking his co-star Dolph Lundgren to throw genuine full-force punches during their fight sequences in order to achieve authentic on-screen impact. One particular blow struck his chest with enough force to cause significant medical consequences. According to Stallone's own accounts, his heart began to swell following the impact, his blood pressure rose to a dangerous level, and he was airlifted from the Canadian production location to an intensive care unit in California, where he remained under close medical supervision for several days. That is what real commitment to a role looked like, and the audience never saw a frame of it. The injuries continued accumulating over the decades. He has been open about multiple surgeries, including back operations and a spinal fusion procedure. While filming The Expendables, a fight sequence with Steve Austin reportedly resulted in a neck injury serious enough to require a metal plate to be surgically implanted. Stallone has acknowledged that his body was never quite the same after that production. Reports from 2025 noted that he had undergone additional back surgery, with public appearances showing him using a cane, a significant image shift for a man whose entire public identity had been built around physical dominance. But none of those physical trials, not the nerve damage at birth, not the medical emergencies, not the surgeries, prepared him for what arrived in the summer of 2012. His eldest son, Sage Stallone, died at the age of 36. The cause was determined to be coronary artery disease stemming from atherosclerosis, a natural death, in the medical sense of that phrase, though there is nothing natural about a parent outliving a child. On a movie set, there are always solutions. Another take, a different angle, a script rewrite that steers the story somewhere more bearable. Grief doesn't offer any of those options. For decades, Stallone had played men who protected the people they loved, who absorbed every blow so that others didn't have to. In that private moment of loss, all of the strength the public had spent years celebrating meant nothing. He couldn't trade on it. He couldn't perform his way through it. All he could do was stand inside the pain, keep breathing, and keep living with the knowledge that a part of his life had gone permanently quiet. He stayed largely away from media attention during that period. He handled his grief with the same privacy he had always kept around the things that genuinely mattered to him. The silence he maintained then may have said more about his character than any interview he ever gave. Through all of it, the career peaks and the quiet stretches, the physical toll and the personal devastation, Jennifer Flavin has been the consistent presence at the center of his private life. Their relationship spans decades, and what she witnessed across those years was not the man on the movie posters. It was the man who came home after those movie posters were printed, still carrying the weight of whatever the day had demanded of him. She saw the aftermath of surgeries, the quiet difficulty of recoveries, the emotional cost of maintaining an image the world had decided was permanent. She watched him navigate the particular loneliness that arrives when millions of people think they know you, but only one person actually does. Their marriage was not without serious difficulty. In 2022, after 25 years together, Jennifer filed for divorce. It appeared, to the outside world, that even this relationship had finally reached a breaking point. But they found their way back to each other, not through any dramatic gesture or Hollywood-style reconciliation, but through the quieter and more difficult work of choosing to continue. What they returned to was not perfect, but it was real. A partnership built on the kind of endurance that looks nothing like what he ever portrayed on screen, and is more impressive for it. The transition from the man who defined an era of action cinema to a man learning to live within the natural limits of aging has been, in some ways, the most demanding role of his career. The 1980s version of Stallone was constructed to appear limitless. The present version wakes each morning with joints that remember every punch he ever threw, every stunt he insisted on performing himself, every physical risk he accepted without hesitation, because it was the only way he knew how to do things. The body keeps a more accurate record than any film archive, and his body has been keeping that record for a very long time. What's striking about how he navigates it is the absence of self-pity. He doesn't appear to hide the limitations, and he doesn't seem to spend much energy mourning the body he used to have. He simply continues, working on projects like Tulsa King, where he leans into the texture of age rather than fighting it, treating the weight of accumulated experience as something to use rather than something to conceal. The audience that grew up watching him has also grown older, and they recognize something in that honesty that the invincible version could never have offered them. The shape of his life today has settled into something that would have been unrecognizable to the young man in that cold apartment. The financial pressure that once defined his daily existence is long gone. The need to prove himself, to every producer who told him no, to every person who looked at his face and decided he wasn't right for the part, has finally quieted. He writes. He creates. He spends time with his family in a way that the relentless pace of his peak years didn't always permit. He has the rare luxury of being able to look at what he built and feel something resembling peace, rather than the constant pressure to build more. The championship belt, as it were, has been set down. Not surrendered, set down. There's a difference. He didn't lose. He finished. And what he leaves behind is not just a filmography or a box office record, but something more durable than either. The proof that a kid from a broken home, with a damaged face and a voice no one could quite categorize, could bet everything on his own story and be right. We started this with a man and a typewriter in a freezing apartment, with nothing to offer the world except a story it hadn't asked for yet. What he did with that is the full answer to every person who ever decided he wasn't worth the effort of a real opportunity. The greatest victory of his life was never recorded in a ring. It was quieter than that, and it took much longer, and it cost everything he had. But he won it. If this story stayed with you, consider liking this video and subscribing. It's the best way to support more storytelling like this, and it helps more people find it who might need to hear it.